Boldwood presents An Heiress's Courage, written by Evelyn Hood and read by Kirsty Cox. Chapter 1. Morag Weir surged impatiently into his brother's house as though he owned it, divesting himself speedily of his bowler hat and handing it and his walking stick to Morag. "Good afternoon, Morag." "Good afternoon, Uncle Lawrence." She had to edge round him in order to reach the coat stand, which was right behind him, but it would never have occurred to him to hang up his own hat. He didn't look at her or move out of her way, too busy concentrating, as usual, on pulling his silver watch from his waistcoat pocket and consulting it with a frown to see how much time he could afford to spend in the house. Since a weakening heart had forced his brother Sander to take to his bed, Lawrence had fallen into the habit of calling every Saturday and Sunday, and on 3 weekdays during his midday break from the large grocer's shop, where he had started years before as an errand boy, and had worked his way up towards the exalted position of under-manager by way of the bacon counter. The scented hair oil he favoured wafted towards Morag from the hat. It was lined with silk, for Morag Weir set great store by appearances and always dressed smartly. "So, how is the invalid today?" he asked. "Much the same. The doctor says—" she began, but Lawrence was already striding up the handsome staircase on his way to Sander's room. As he reached the half-landing and moved out of sight, Morag hung his hat on a hook and put his stick into the stand with slightly more force than was needed, made a face at herself in the mirror, and went to the kitchen to make tea. Lawrence was pacing the bedroom when she took in the tea tray. He moved restlessly from the large bed to the window, talking volubly, but falling silent as soon as she entered, and moving to the window to stand with his back to the room, staring down at the River Clyde. Morag bit her lip as she looked at the tray lying on the small table by the bed and saw that the light lunch she had so carefully prepared had scarcely been touched. She opened her mouth to protest, but Sander Weir, propped against a mound of snowy pillows, raised a hand slightly, and Morag folded her lips over the forbidden words and replaced the tray with the one she had just brought up. "Thank you, my dear," Sander said. As she went out and closed the door, she heard Lawrence burst into speech again, as though he had been bottling up the words in her presence. Back in the scullery, a small stone-floored room built onto the back of the house for use as a laundry room, she finished hauling wet clothes from the boiler and wrung them out by hand in the sink before putting them through the huge, unwieldy mangle, which squeezed the last possible drop of water from them. Then she folded them into a basket and carried them out to the back garden. Lilybank Road had been built on a bluff above the Clyde shoreline, and the back gardens on this side of the road all sloped downwards. Below, hidden by the hedges that marked the garden boundaries, lay a railway line, and below that, on the other side of the shore road that led to the neighbouring town of Greenock, were the shipyards that fringed the river. Although the continuous clang and rattle of the yards could be heard throughout the town, the Lilybank houses and gardens were high enough to overlook them, except for the high cranes, which made their own erratic pattern against the background of the river. March winds had been blowing hard all through the previous week, but today there was only a breeze, just strong enough to make the sheets already hanging on the clothesline stir restlessly most of the time, but tossing and stretching now and again like sails readying themselves to take a ship across the seas to foreign lands. The air was soft with the promise of spring, and crocuses and daffodils had brightened the dreary winter garden. Morag pegged her own and Sander's underclothes onto the line, automatically choosing an area behind the sheets so that nobody could see them. Not that anyone would, for their neighbours in this row of large houses were folk like themselves, intent always upon keeping their own counsel and minding their own business. Certainly not the type to ogle other people's nether garments on a washing line. But Georgina Weir had instilled the niceties of life into Morag from the beginning, and habits learned in childhood were difficult to break. When the basket was empty, she picked it up and then paused, resting it against her hip as she took in the panorama spread before her. As it passed Port Glasgow, the River Clyde, opening out into a firth on its way to the sea, was a broad stretch of water filled at almost any hour of the day with the bustle of cargo ships, passenger steamers, colliers and tugboats, as well as the small steam puffers that carried all manner of goods to the many islands studded throughout the firth and further north to the islands and coastal towns of the west of Scotland. A passenger-carrying paddle steamer thrashing its way downriver from Glasgow slid past a cargo ship, low in the water, heading in the opposite direction to offload at a Glasgow port. There were some puffers beetling along, and in the distance, tacking near to the residential town of Helensburgh on the opposite bank, she could see the snowy sails of 2 yachts. Lawrence Weir called to her from the back door, and reluctantly she made her way back to the house. He was in the hall when she arrived, fussily consulting his watch while waiting for her to hand him his hat and stick. "Leaving so soon, Uncle Lawrence?" "Some of us," he told her crisply, studying himself in the mirror and brushing an imaginary piece of fluff from his high, rounded white shirt collar, "have work to do. Sander had a mind to sit by the window, so I helped him into his chair before I left him. You're not going to the tea shop today?" "I'm due to start in an hour." "Your Aunt Margaret tells me that she called in there for a cup of tea the other day while she was shopping in Gourock," he remarked, using the mirror to check that his hat had been set at its usual dandified angle. "She was not impressed by the cashier on duty. Slow with the change, she said, and tried to keep back a halfpence for herself." "I'm sure she just made a mistake counting out the money." Said Lawrence darkly, and departed. "Fetch my telescope," Sander ordered as soon as Morag went into the bedroom, where he now sat in his large wheeled bath chair by the window. When his wife was alive, they had shared one of the 2 large bedrooms at the front of the house, but almost immediately on being widowed, Sander had moved into a back room where he had a view of the river. "You scarcely ate a bite of your lunch," Morag accused, doing as she was told. "I wasn't hungry. I'll take it for my dinner tonight." "It'll not heat up again." He stared intently through the handsome old telescope at the river below. "I thought so. There's the Ailsa Craig on her way upriver, low in the water too, so she's carrying a full cargo." Pleased, he laid down the telescope as Morag came to look over his shoulder at the puffer, one of the 5 owned by Weir Shipping. "If it won't heat up again, I'll have it cold." "You will not. If you didn't have the appetite to eat it hot, you'll never manage it cold," she scolded. And Sander, who hated waste, especially at his own expense, looked vexed. "You'd have been best not to give me anything at all, since I wasn't hungry anyway." "I'm supposed to be tempting your appetite. The doctor said—" "Ach, doctors. What do they know? How can a man have an appetite when he's stuck indoors all day and every day, with never a bit of exercise or a lungful of fresh air?" "The weather's improving. By next week we'll maybe be able to get you out into the back garden." He gave a gusty sigh. "Aye, sitting in a chair. God, Morag, I wish I could get out onto the water again." "It's been a good while since you were on the boats." She tidied the empty bed with deft sweeps of her hands and plumped up the pillows. "I know, thanks to this." Resentfully, he thumped his large fist on the chair just where the blanket in his lap lay flat, instead of mounding over his left leg. "That damned war has a lot to answer for." Even though he had been housebound all winter, Sander's cheeriness and sense of humour had been to the fore. He very rarely complained about the loss of limb during service in the Great War, which had put an end to his work as mate of one of the Clyde puffers. This sudden surge of bitterness was an indication as to just how low he felt. "Would you like me to strap the leg on for you?" It was in the wardrobe, a thing of metal and cloth and leather straps, which had terrified her the first time she had come across it when jumping into the wardrobe as a child to hide away from her mother. "No point, since I can't walk about on it." The fist that had thumped the emptiness beneath the blanket clenched until the knuckles whitened, and he sighed. Sander Weir was quite unlike his younger brother Lawrence, broad-shouldered instead of slim, weather-beaten instead of pale-skinned, for he had always been an active man with a strong dislike of being indoors. On his feet, he stood a good head taller than Lawrence, and, even now, his features drawn after an illness that had confined him to the house for the past 3 months, he was by far the better-looking of the brothers. With his head of thick grey hair and brown eyes crinkled at the corners with laughter lines. "You'll be walking again come the summer," Morag reassured him now. Lawrence doesn't he think so? He's been on at me those past few weeks to let him take control of the business, so's I don't have to worry about anything, he says." His usual humour swept back as he gave a snort of laughter. "I'd be more worried than ever, with a grocer trying to run my shipping business." "He's not a grocer now. He's an under-manager. And anyway, there's no need for anyone to take over," Morag said firmly, furious with Lawrence. Pessimism was the last thing Sander needed. Did his brother not realise that? "You're managing fine, even though you can't be down at the harbour." She returned to join him at the window, leaning forward to look down at the busy river below. "Mr. Laird'll be along tonight with the books." "Aye, right enough." Sander brightened at the thought of his clerk's visit. Going over the books with the man helped him to feel that he was still involved in the small shipping company he owned. "I'll tell you what, lass. You put the kettle on and make another cup of tea. I couldn't enjoy the last one for listening to Lawrence fussing on about this and that. The man puts a sour taste in my mouth." He shook his head. "Being the under-manager of a grocer's shop seems an awful hard responsibility for him." "Uncle Lawrence takes his work seriously." "He does that. Even when he was on the bacon counter he took his work seriously. I mind Georgina saying that it fair made her skin itch, watching Lawrence work out the exact thickness of a slice of ham." He paused, then said thoughtfully, "He's ambitious too. He and that wife of his have high expectations." "Have they?" Morag collected the tray and made for the door. She never quite knew what Sander really thought of his younger brother, and was always reluctant to pass any comment about Lawrence, in case she said the wrong thing. When she returned with fresh tea, it was to find that his mind was still on his brother. "It's strange the way things have worked out," he said, as she set the tea things out on a small table within his reach and poured the first cup for him. "When the two of us were lads, I asked for nothing else but to work on the puffers when I grew up. But Lawrence wanted much more. Money, and a fine house, and to be important in other folks' eyes. I always thought that our mother, rest her soul, encouraged him too much in that direction. And how did it turn out? I end up with everything Lawrence would have wanted for himself, while he had to claw his way up to become an under-manager in a grocer's shop. It soured him. He's resented me for it ever since, especially where Georgina was concerned." "Mother?" It made her uncomfortable to hear him criticise his younger brother. Recently, following Lawrence's visits, he had been doing it more often, and she always tried to change the subject. But on this occasion, her curiosity was aroused. "He wanted her for himself,
And why wouldn't he, since she was the bonniest lass in the area, and her father owned a fine stone quarry and some handsome property to boot? Marriage to Georgina would have suited Lawrence very nicely. But it was me she chose, for all that my brother looked more of a gentleman. It was the only time I ever won over Lawrence, and what a grand prize I got. For a moment, his eyes misted at the thought of his beloved wife, dead now for several years. Then he cleared his throat and blinked rapidly. Lawrence still resents me for that. Though when he comes fawning round me, he thinks I'm too stupid to remember the past, or the things he said to me when he first heard that Georgina and I were to wed. He glanced up at her from under bushy grey brows, his deep-set brown eyes suddenly alight with mischief. She knew that look well. In her childhood, it had usually meant that he was about to draw her into some ploy that would end with Georgina railing at the two of them and ordering her husband to grow up, for goodness sake, and stop setting a bad example to the child. She waited to find out what torment he was planning for his unfortunate brother, but he merely said, It's strange how daft folk always seem to think that it's others who are daft, not them at all. Uncle Lawrence means no harm, Morag said uncomfortably. Then, aware of the way time was whirling past, Now, there's an exercise book and a pencil and your newspaper to hand. Are you sure you'll be all right until I get back from the tea shop? Of course I will, he said with some surprise, as though he, and not she, had been the one to organise his comfort. There was just enough time to change into the white blouse and black knitted skirt and jacket she wore while on duty at the tea shop. These days, she thought as she ran a comb through her hair and smoothed the blouse collar into place, she seemed to do nothing but rush. She had to run down the road and spent the tram journey to Gourock taking deep breaths and thinking calming thoughts. Miss Lamont, the tea shop owner, liked her staff to appear serene and unflustered at all times. Gourock was the last of the 3 towns snuggled shoulder to shoulder along that section of the Clyde shoreline. While Port Glasgow and Greenock were industrial towns, Gourock was residential, catering for those who had made their money and wanted to settle in comfort on a picturesque part of the Clyde shoreline. It also catered for the river travellers, having a large railway station directly linked to the pier where passenger steamers could be found, particularly at weekends and during the summer, lying bow to stern along the length of the pier or waiting on the river for an empty berth. The tea shop, where Morag worked as a cashier, was situated at a short distance from the station and pier, in order to deter day trippers and to encourage what Miss Lamont and her sister, joint owners, referred to as a better class of clientele. Some 10 years earlier, the younger Miss Lamont had become the second wife of a manager in the Gourock ropeworks and had retired from business to devote her time to looking after him, his growing family and his large, comfortable home, leaving her sister to run the establishment single-handed. Morag had obtained her post there because she came from a good address and because Miss Lamont and Georgina had liked the look of each other at the interview. Morag herself had been an onlooker rather than the job applicant. Being a cashier in a tea shop is respectable enough work for someone of your class, and you'll meet a nice type of people in Gourock, Georgina had said when she tried to object. But I want to work with people of my own age. Everyone else in the tea shop is much older than me. Nonsense! Young ladies come in with their mothers, and young men too. You'll get to know them. You'll make new friends, Georgina said, with a gleam in her wide blue eyes. Morag well knew what the gleam meant. She's hoping that some rich young man will come with his mother and fall in love with me in the time it takes him to drink a cup of tea and eat an Empire biscuit, she told her best friend Wilma gloomily. Maybe he will. Who sees me stuck in a wee glass cashier's box in the corner?
the prince found Snow White in a glass box," said Wilma, ever the optimist. "That was a coffin, and so's the thing I work in," Morag said in despair. "But I doubt if any young man, rich or otherwise, will ever notice me in it." She was right. After 5 years at the tea shop, trapped behind the glass of the cashier's booth with little to do but check bills, take in money, give out change and watch the waitresses rush hither and thither at the whim of the bored, well-dressed women who came in for morning coffee and afternoon tea, she had not met anyone at all. Sometimes the women brought their adult children with them, both male and female, but they too were bored and, as far as Morag was concerned, extremely uninteresting. Today was no different from any other day. Perched on her stool within the little glass box at one end of the room, she watched women sweep in and then out again, replete with tea and cakes and ready to get on with their lives. She could, perhaps, have made a bid for freedom after Georgina's death from a stroke, but by then Sander's heart was giving him trouble, and the shock of his wife's sudden death did not help. Morag was needed at home, but had suddenly panicked at the prospect of giving up her only scrap of independence. Tedious though the work was, it allowed her to spend some time out of the house and to earn some money of her own. Her employer had agreed reluctantly to let her work for 3 afternoons a week instead of full-time, so that she could look after the house and her ailing father. She would have aged before her time and become as dull and uninteresting as the customers, or the waitresses, most of whom talked about nothing else but their aching feet and their dislike of the customers, if it hadn't been for Wilma, who insisted that they spend at least one evening a week together and some time at the weekends. Now that spring was on the way and Sander's health was improving, Morag could look forward to the occasional short steamer trip with her friend to the Great Cumbrae, where they could hire cycles and spin round the island with the salt wind whipping colour into their faces. Cheered by the thought, she beamed at the waitress passing her booth, and the girl smiled tentatively back and asked, "Would you like a wee cup of tea?" "I could do with one, Grace," Morag said gratefully. Grace Hasty, a gentle, self-effacing girl, was younger than the other waitresses. Her slight figure and long, slim neck always seemed to Morag to be too fragile to balance the mass of fair hair pinned at the back of her neat skull. When Grace brought the tea, Morag said, "I was just thinking, now that the better weather's coming in, I'll be able to go across to the Cumbraes with my friend and cycle round the island. Do you ever go on trips on the steamers?" "I've never got much time. There's always plenty to do at home." It was quite a long speech for Grace, who never had much to say for herself. The other waitresses tended to think of her as standoffish, putting on airs because her father was a foreman at Gourock Ropeworks, and the family lived in one of the handsome flats the works rented out to its top and middle management. But Morag felt that there was more to it than that, and would have liked to get to know the girl better. "You should come with us she began, but just then a fur-clad woman at a corner table flapped a hand in the air and called, "Waitress!" in ringing tones. Grace was off at once, leaving Morag alone in her upright glass coffin. Chapter 2. John Laird, Sander's office manager, arrived on the doorstep at exactly 7:30 p.m. His frail-looking body pulled to one side by the large, battered case in which he always carried the ledgers and account books. Once she had escorted him to the bedroom, Morag escaped from the house and hurried to Ardgowan Street, where her friend Wilma Beckett lived in a tenement flat. Ever since her earliest school days, when she and Wilma had shared a desk, Morag had loved her visits to the Beckett household. Even her mother's disapproval hadn't managed to break the firm bond formed on their first day at school, when 5-year-old Wilma had slipped 2 toffees from the pocket of her smock and pressed one into Morag's hand. Keep it tucked in your cheek, she had instructed out of the side of her mouth. And mind that one. She ducked her head in the teacher's direction. Doesn't he see you sucking? Morag, her fear and homesickness calmed as much by the act of kindness as by the sticky, sugary sweet, had known from that moment that Wilma and she were fated to be best friends forever. Mr. Beckett, a shipyard worker, had died in his mid-30s of a chronic lung complaint, leaving his wife Mags to raise their 3 sons and 3 daughters single-handed. This she had done, taking on any kind of work that would bring in a few pennies to support her family. The 3 oldest children, 2 sons who had followed their fathers into the shipyards and a daughter, were married with homes of their own. But as Mags Beckett was still the living heart of her family, they and their partners and children were usually to be found crowded into the flat in Ardgowan Street. Morag was therefore not surprised to find the kitchen full when she arrived. The menfolk, sons and son-in-law, sat around the big table that filled most of the living room cum kitchen. Mrs. Beckett, her considerable bulk squeezed into a small space by the sink, was ironing a pile of clothes, while Wilma and her married sister sat at the fire, cheek by jowl with an elderly neighbour and both daughters-in-law, one heavily pregnant and the other suckling a small baby. The only Becketts missing were the 2 youngest, Daisy and Archie. "Come on!" Wilma dragged Morag into one of the 2 small bedrooms. "You can't hear yourself think in that kitchen. Anyway, I want to show you my new blouse. We'll have to use Archie's room, for Daisy's doing her homework in ours, and she'll screech like a scalded cat if we disturb her. I'll just fetch it." Morag waited, perched on the edge of Archie's narrow bed. Although his brothers had gone to work in the shipyards, Archie, ever the adventurer, had opted to work on the puffers and was mate on the Saga, one of the 5 boats owned by Sander Weir. The room, not much larger than a cupboard, smelled of tar and oil and grease from his working clothes, underlaid with the strong scent of the pomade he liked to put on his hair when he was off duty. All the Becketts were handsome, but Archie, with his beguiling grin and sparkling deep blue eyes, his confident bearing and curly black hair, was undoubtedly the best looking. He strongly resembled the dashing brigands featured in some romantic stories for women. There was even an air of danger about him that drew the girls to him like moths desperate to reach a flame that could easily destroy them. Archie was the apple of his mother's eye because, as she often said, he was his father's spit and image. Morag heard a murmur of protest from Daisy, then Wilma was back in the room with the new blouse tossed over one arm. "She's as crabbit as an old hen when she gets interrupted at her books. It's a good thing she's leaving the school soon and coming into Birkmeyer's with me." Like most of the women and girls in Port Glasgow, Wilma worked at the Gourock Ropeworks, known locally as the Gourock, and to the female workers as Birkmeyer's, after the family that owned it. She stripped off her blouse to don the new one, displaying rounded arms and full breasts swelling above her lace-trimmed crêpe-de-chine cami knickers. Wilma loved nice underwear and, her sisters claimed, spent more money on herself underneath than on top. "What do you think?" Her fingers nimbly slid each button into its allotted buttonhole, then she gave a little shrug, and the blouse, orange-red and of a silky texture, seemed to ripple and shift as it fell into place, giving the effect of moving flames or richly bronzed autumn leaves tossing in the wind. "Oh, Wilma, it's beautiful. I thought it would do for the Saturday night dancing. Geordie Lewis is taking me." Wilma stripped the blouse off. "Here, you try it." The material was soft and warm and perfumed from contact with Wilma's skin. Morag loved the feel of it, but it didn't look nearly as well on her as it did on her friend. Its bold, dramatic shade suited Wilma's jet black hair, whereas it clashed with her own auburn head. "I don't suit it at all. Try loosening your hair. You always have it pinned up like an animal penned in a cage." Wilma yanked the ribbon from the nape of Morag's neck to let her long hair tumble free, and as she moved into the mirror's range, the proximity of Wilma's smooth olive skin and black hair seemed to bring the blouse to flickering life again. When they were together, Morag thought despairingly, she herself was so clearly the less attractive of the two, with her pale skin and uninteresting hair. "You should get your hair cut, like mine." Wilma's first act on leaving school and obtaining a place at the Guruk Ropeworks had been to have her hair bobbed so that it fitted around her head like a gleaming black cap. She had told Morag dreadful stories about machinists at the mill who had carelessly let their heads get too close to the huge, relentlessly throbbing machines they tended and had been horribly mutilated. The women who worked with the spinning and twisting machines had to wear one-piece boiler suits, and they were all under orders to keep their hair tied back or covered with scarves. Many of them, like Wilma, had bobs. "I don't think that would make much difference." Morag had apparently inherited her straight reddish-brown locks from her maternal grandmother. Georgina, her own hair an indifferent brown, had spent hours during Morag's childhood brushing it and wrapping it up in rags every night. But to no avail, since it always hung limply in the morning when the rags were removed. At school, she had worn it in one long plait and spent a good part of each day fending off the boys who loved to tug at it. Many a time when her tormentors attacked in strength and there were too many for her to deal with on her own, she'd had to be rescued by Wilma, a small tornado whirling her satchel by the strap like a hammer-throwing athlete. Wilma's own rebellious locks frequently escaped from the straggling bow that started each morning at the nape of her neck, then slid lower and lower until, by the time the afternoon bell freed them all from the classroom, it clung desperately to a solitary lock. But nobody ever dared to pull it, or to steal her ribbon, for retribution was swift, and Wilma Beckett had no qualms about using teeth and nails on anyone who annoyed her. "You just need something in a different colour," she advised now. "Green, maybe. There was some nice deep green material in the shop. We could go there tomorrow." "I don't need a new blouse." "You do if you're coming dancing with me." "You're going dancing with your young man." "He's not my young man," Wilma said scathingly. "He's just a lad who's taking me to the dancing. He'd be happy to take you as well." "No, he wouldn't." "Yes, he would, if I told him to." "I've got my father to see too. I couldn't go out 2 nights in a row." "You can't spend the whole of your life looking after an invalid, Morag. You're too young for that." "I don't mind." "I know you don't, but that's only because you're too nice altogether. What about your auntie? Could she not take a turn of sitting with your father?" Morag gave a snort of laughter at the idea. "I can't see Aunt Margaret doing that. Anyway, she has Uncle Lawrence to look after, and Flora and Crawford. My mam had 6 of us, and she always managed to look after sick folk as well, relatives and neighbours. It did us no harm to have to be without her for a few hours now and again." "I don't know how to dance." "It's time you learned then. I'll teach you." Wilma jumped to her feet. "There's not much room here, but we can do our best." Humming a tune, she pulled Morag to her feet and began to dance her around the tiny piece of linoleum available between Archie's bed and the minute dresser. Helpless with laughter, tripping and tumbling onto the bed as often as not, they went through every dance that Wilma knew. It came as a shock when Morag heard a church clock chime 9 o'clock. "Is that the time? I'll have to go." "You've just come." She searched for the discarded ribbon, found it, and gathered her hair back in one large handful. "I've been here for nearly 2 hours. John Laird will be leaving in 5 minutes. "I'll walk halfway with you," Wilma said, as always, stripping off the blouse. While she pulled a jersey on over her dark head, Morag, her hair tamed, smoothed and folded the blouse, relishing the feel of the soft material beneath her fingers. Daisy was in the kitchen now, and Archie and his girlfriend had arrived. There were 2 more neighbours in the room too, and the older of the babies, gurgling with pleasure, was being bounced into the air by his father. The air was thick with tobacco smoke from the men's cigarettes and pipes. The range had been stoked, and the ironing board had been put away. The family were clearly settling in for at least another hour of talking.
"Away already, hen?" Mrs. Beckett asked from the stove where she was making a batch of drop scones for her ever-hungry family. "Daisy's just brewed a fresh pot of tea. Could you no stay and have a cup?"
"I have to go home. My father," Morag said regretfully. Just then, in the sudden lull following a piercing scream of delight from the baby, one of the men was heard to say,
"So he says he'd be damned if he would, and then the gaffer—" "What did you say?"
Mrs. Beckett whirled round, the good-tempered smile on her face suddenly obliterated by a fearsome scowl. The men looked at each other apprehensively, shuffling their feet.
"It was nothing, ma'am. Just a bit of crack about the work. It wasn't nothing at all, Robbie. It was foul language."
Robbie, a husky young man who could have given a good account of himself in any pub brawl, went crimson.
"It was just the one wee word. And anyway, it wasn't me that said it. It was this man at the work. It was your mouth it tumbled out of, not his."
His mother gave him a hefty open-handed slap on the back of the head.
"You know fine that I'll not have foul language in my house." "But you never said a word last night when Archie said
Robbie yelped again as he received another clout, this time on one ear.
"Will you take a telling? In front of your sisters, and Morag too." "It's different when it's Archie. He can't do any wrong," Robbie muttered sullenly.
And Archie, balancing his sweetheart on one knee with a casual arm slung about her waist to support her, grinned and winked at him.
"Are you going to apologise, or do you want another slap for your impertinence?" "I'm sorry, ma'am." Robbie rubbed at his stinging head. "I should think so too."
"How is your father, lassie?" Mrs. Beckett turned back to Morag, as though their conversation had never been interrupted. "Not too bad. Wearying for some good weather so as he can get out to sit in the garden."
"We could all do with a bit of sunshine,"
Mrs. Beckett agreed, adding, as always,
"Haste you back, lassie. We're always pleased to see you."
"I don't know what got into our Robbie," Wilma said apologetically as they scurried down the stone staircase to the narrow close that led out onto the street. "He knows fine that Mam will not tolerate bad language." She ended in a squeak of surprise as she bounced out of the close mouth ahead of Morag and almost collided with a man striding past. He steadied her and began to apologise. Then his voice trailed away as she looked up, turning her face into the glow of the street lamp.
"It's yourself, Wilma."
"Hello, Danny." She stepped back, moving away from his steadying grasp. "What are you doing in Ardgowan Street? Have you been courting?" His empty hands, no longer needed, fell back to his sides. Because his back was to the lamp, Morag didn't actually see colour flooding into his face, but somehow she knew, by the set of his shoulders and the tone of his voice when he said,
"I've been out running with the Harriers Club,"
that the blush was there, hot and crimson. "The Harriers? Now, if you'd been out walking," Wilma told him pertly, "I'd maybe have gone with you."
"Would you?"
"You never know. This is my friend Morag." He whipped his cap off.
"Good evening."
Morag returned the greeting and wished, as an awkward silence began to grow, that she could think of the right thing to say. Wilma always knew what to say, but maddeningly on this occasion she chose to remain silent, watching Danny with eyes that sparkled with mischief in the lamplight.
"I'd best be getting home then,"
he said at last, cramming the cap back onto his tumbled fair hair. "See you tomorrow," Wilma said cheerfully, and he raced off along the road, not quite running, but walking swiftly. Who was that? It seemed to Morag that the man's face and fair hair were vaguely familiar. Just one of the foremen at the mill. Morag had no idea why she thought she knew him. Would you have gone walking with him if he'd asked? Of course not. That's a shame. He looks like a nice lad, and he's got a real fancy for you. If I went out with every lad who takes a fancy for me, you and me'd never see each other. Danny's nice enough, and he's good to the women at the work, but he's too shy and quiet for my liking. His father's a right beggar. He's been a foreman forever, and the women who work in his section hate him. Him and Danny are as different as chalk and cheese. She put a hand under Morag's arm in order to navigate her through a knot of youths lingering on the pavement outside a fish and chip shop, eating with their fingers from newspaper-wrapped bundles. They took up the entire pavement, their muscular, sweat-smelling bodies barring the girl's way, and for a moment, Morag panicked. But Wilma merely pushed into the midst of the group and poked her fingers into one of the bundles, ordering, "Give us a chip then, Johnny Dunn."
"As many as you want."
Johnny held out the package, beaming round at his mates, pleased that she had singled him out. "You can have one of mine." The youth nearest to Morag pushed his bundle under her nose. She was about to refuse, but the smell of freshly cooked fish and chips was inviting. The strip of potato was delicious, crisply fried on the outside and soft and hot on the inside.
"Here, have the rest of my chips, Wilma. I've finished with them," Johnny offered. Then eagerly, "And we'll walk you home."
"You'll do no such thing." She took the crumpled paper from him and popped another chip into her mouth. "We're on our way to meet our young men, and they'd not be pleased to find the likes of you tagging on behind us."
"Who are you going to meet then?" he challenged.
"That'd be telling."
"Is yours as good looking as me?"
"His dog's better looking than you, and it's got the mange. Tar for the chips." She pushed him aside and swept on, Morag scurrying in her wake, as the rest of the youths sniggered noisily at poor Johnny's expense. "A nice enough lad, but he's got too big a conceit of himself. Have another chip," Wilma offered, as the two girls rounded the corner into Chapelton Street. By the time they had finished the chips between them, they had reached the halfway point where they usually separated. Wilma thrust a handkerchief into Morag's hand. "Wipe the grease off your fingers with that," she ordered, and Morag obeyed, then returned the handkerchief and set off on the uphill walk home, while Wilma skipped back to the crowded tenement kitchen. Chapter 3. As Danny Hasty walked home, his mind was filled with the memory of Wilma Beckett's vivacious little face, washed by lamplight, and the feel of her shoulders beneath his hands. He wondered if she had meant it when she said that she would have gone walking with him, and wished that someday he might find the courage to ask her. He was so busy thinking about her that he had covered the length of Bouverie Street and was well past his own close before he realised that he was home. The street, halfway up the hill that rose from the shoreline, consisted of a long row of sturdy 4-storey sandstone tenements built by the Birkmeyer family and rented out to lower and middle management in their rope works. As a senior foreman and a long-standing employee, Bill Hasty, Danny's father, had been allotted a cosy home consisting of 2 rooms and a large kitchen on the 3rd floor of one of the buildings. Danny himself, recently promoted to foreman, stood a good chance of getting a flat in the same street if he should marry. Mounting the stairs, he thought with a touch of bitterness alien to his placid nature that wasn't likely. He wanted only one girl, and he was such a ham-fisted, tongue-tied idiot that he would never find the courage to woo her, not even if they were the only 2 people in the world with eternity before them. Wilma was popular, with the other girls as well as with every man who knew her, and he was too frightened of failure, of her laughing at him, either to his face or, even worse, behind his back with her friends. His father, a bare-knuckle boxer in his youth, had always told him that he was spineless, and his father was right. In any case, now that he was a foreman, he couldn't afford to be made a laughing-stock at the mill.
"Always remember, lad, that you must stand apart from the rest," Bill Hasty had instructed when the appointment was announced. "You are their superior, and you must always be their superior. It makes no difference if they hate you for it. In fact," he added with relish, That can be all for the better.
The living room was silent and peaceful, with only his sister Grace in it, her head bent over her sewing. A pile of neatly darned and folded clothes lay on the table nearby, and her bare feet rested in a basin of water. She looked up and smiled at him as he went in. "Did you enjoy yourself?"
It was grand, he told her enthusiastically. It had been more than grand up on the hills, with the lights of Port Glasgow, Greenock and Gourock spread out below him, the river shimmering palely beyond, and the town of Helensburgh sprinkled like a handful of diamonds on the far bank. It had given him a rare and precious sense of freedom. It had made him feel that, for once, he could breathe properly. "You've brought in the smell of the hills with you?" She wrinkled her neat nose and sniffed appreciatively. "I'll make us a cup of tea in a minute." "I'll see to it, and no argument," he added as she began to protest. "You need to rest your feet."
In the Hasty household, the men were always looked on as the breadwinners and the women as the skivvies. Secretly, Danny disagreed with this edict, and when his father wasn't around, he often made tea, or set the table, or washed some dishes. After all, Grace went out to work too, as a waitress in a tea shop. It seemed wrong to him that she was also expected to toil in the house in the evenings and at weekends while her father and brother were idle. While waiting for the kettle to boil, he stood at the window over the sink, looking down over the great bulk of the Gourock Ropeworks mill where he and his father worked, to the river beyond. It, too, gave him that wonderful sense of space and freedom. After making the tea, he tossed a towel over his shoulder and, when he had handed his sister her cup, he knelt down and lifted one foot from the basin, then began to dry it.
"Danny," she protested, trying to push him away. "Don't make such a fuss, woman. You drink your tea and leave me be," he instructed. And after a further half-hearted protest, she did as she was told, sipping gratefully at the hot drink and then resting her head, with its pinned-up mass of soft fair hair, against the high back of her chair and closing her eyes. "I believe I could enjoy being a lady, with servants to obey my every whim," she murmured. "Maybe one day you will be."
"Aye, that'll be right." A smile curved the corners of her mouth. "And on that same day, folk will be able to walk across the Clyde instead of needing to go by boat." She had pretty feet, small and slim like the rest of her. Danny, too, was fair, but while he had inherited his maternal grandfather's sturdy body, Grace had taken after their father's side of the family and was neatly built and pale-skinned.
"There, that's you done."
Looking up at her from below, he could see the violet shadows beneath her eyes and the weariness about her mouth. Their mother had been delicate all her life and had died of heart trouble while Grace was still at school. Danny still suffered from the loss of her, and although Grace was fit enough, he was secretly haunted by the fear that she too might die at an early age.
"You should go to bed," he urged,
handing her stockings and getting to his feet, the basin in his big hands. "I'll just wait until Father comes in. He'll maybe need fresh tea." A wave of irritation suddenly rose in Danny.
"For God's sake," he wanted to cry out, "why can't you do as you please for once and not as he pleases? Why can't we both stop letting him rule every last fragment of our lives?"
But he bit back the hot words, knowing that they would only distress his sister, as his frustration always did. Better to leave things be, he told himself, as he emptied the basin and carefully dried it before putting it away. He had been 8 years old, and Grace 5, when their father went off to fight in the Great War. Over the next 5 years, they had only seen him sporadically as a noisy stranger who arrived suddenly and unexpectedly to turn their world upside down. taking over the neat little two-roomed flat they then lived in, demanding their mother's continuous attention, talking incessantly and frighteningly about war and killing and danger, his eyes gleaming and his large moustache almost bristling with enthusiasm. Bill Hasty had loved the war, finding in it the male camaraderie, the challenges, the discipline that suited his nature. He had survived without a scratch. What enemy soldier would ever have had the courage to harm a hair on the head of such a formidable man, Danny had thought at the time, and had come home, his medals for long service, loyalty and bravery pinned to the breast of his suit, to a hero's welcome. The neighbours had hung out banners and held a party for him. The ropeworks management had given him instant promotion and, a few years later, the house in Bouverie Street, and he had settled down to rule his family and those under his charge in the mills with a rod of iron, using all the barrack square discipline he had learned and absorbed like mother's milk during his military service. Danny often thought that his father's return had been the beginning of the end of his mother's life. Although she worshipped her husband, she was not strong enough to cope with his energy and drive. A few months after he was demobilised from the army, she miscarried a child and almost died as a result. Within a year of the tragedy, she was to all intents and purposes an invalid, with only another year left to live. Bill Hasty had not married again. Neither, when her chance came along, did Grace, although Danny had always assumed, and as she grew up, hoped, that she would marry and escape their father's tyranny as soon as possible. He had been delighted when she had fallen in love with a friend of his. He could still remember her radiance in those few short weeks, the glow that took Danny's breath away every time he looked at her. But Bill Hasty, used to having his house well cared for and his meals on the table whenever it suited him, had found the young suitor wanting and not good enough for his daughter. Danny had tried to persuade Grace to marry the lad anyway, but while she hesitated, reluctant to defy her father for the first time in her life, her sweetheart left Port Glasgow for a good job in England, and she had never heard from him again. This, her father had lost no time in pointing out, proved that he had never loved her in the first place.
"What sort of man would let me come between him and the woman he loved?" he had demanded of his daughter. "He was a coward, Grace, a snivelling coward. You can do better than the likes of him."
There was still time for Grace, and for himself, but sometimes Danny looked into a frightening future where the two of them drifted along as they were, living their lives to please their father until he died. And by that time, he thought bleakly, they might well be too old and cowed to make much of the years left to them. He started gathering the cups together.
"I'll just rinse them," he began, but Grace,
who had excellent hearing, pushed her stockinged feet into her slippers, sprang up and took the cups from him just as he heard his father's key in the lock and his heavy tread in the tiny hall. When Bill Hasty came into the room, she was at the sink, and Danny by the window. He grunted a greeting and sat down in the most comfortable chair.
"Where's the tea? I've got a right thirst on me."
"Just coming. I'm making some fresh." Grace filled the kettle and lit the gas stove. Bill reached out for the newspaper and snapped it open, making it crack with a sound like a rifle shot, while Danny sat down at the table and concentrated on thinking about Wilma's bright, laughing, fearless face, and how quick and lithe and beautiful she could look, even in the clumsy boiler suits that all the machinists wore at work. When Wilma's school days came to an end on her 13th birthday, Morag, who had celebrated her own birthday a month earlier, did her best to persuade her parents to let her leave school too and go into Birkmeyer's ropeworks with her friend. Apart from a fear of losing Wilma if their lives led in different directions, she wanted to taste the heady pleasure of being one of a crowd, leaving work at the end of the shift linked arm in arm with several other girls, taking up the entire width of the pavement and sharing private jokes. She wanted to go swinging jauntily along the streets at night on her way to or from the cinema or the dance hall with her pals, eating hot, crisp fish and chips from newspaper and cheeking lads the way Wilma could. Georgina has been horrified at the very idea. The Gureks for those who can't do anything else but work machines. Women with no other talents. What talent have I got? Morag had wanted to know, baffled. You're good with figures. All your teachers have said so. Then I'll try for work in Birkmeyer's offices. The very idea! You'll stay on at the school and maybe become a teacher, Georgina had announced. Morag had had no option but to do as her mother decreed, although, as it turned out, she did not have the ability to become a teacher. To her surprise and delight, Georgina, possibly at Sander's urging, had reluctantly accepted the strong friendship between her daughter and the girl from Ardgowan Street, though Wilma was never invited to Lilybank Road. But at least Morag had been able to go on sharing something of the excitement of Wilma's life, even if it was only as a bystander. She arrived home to find that the clerk had helped Sander into bed before leaving. He was propped up against his pillows, peering through a large magnifying glass at a sheet of paper. The entire bed was strewn with books and loose papers.
I'm glad you're back, lass. John's handwriting's getting worse by the day. I'm beginning to wonder if he's getting too old for the work. Fetch the other set of books here, will you?
In the morning. You need your rest. She began to tidy up the mess.
I never do anything else but rest.
Well, I'm tired if you're not. I'd as soon start on the accounts in the morning, Father, when I feel more able for them. She removed the books to the table out of his reach. I'll fetch you a glass of warm milk and get you settled down for the night. Although he was in his mid-30s when the Great War started, and could have stayed at home for a year or two before finally being called on to fight for his country, Sander Weir had enlisted in 1914, only to return home a year later having lost a leg at Ypres. The same fighting spirit that had sent him into war brought him, together with his wife Georgina's dedicated care, through months of pain and rehabilitation. But he had to give up all idea of working on a puffer again. When his wealthy father-in-law offered him a position as a manager of his stone quarry, Sander had had no option but to accept. He handled his new post with the same determination and attention to detail they had once used to guide his boat through a rocky reef during a storm, and when Georgina's father died in 1917, leaving everything to his only child, Sander took over the running of his wife's many business interests. But he was still a seaman at heart, and when Ferguson Tollin, the small shipping company he himself had once worked for, ran into financial difficulties, Sander, with Georgina's blessing, disposed of the quarry and her other assets and bought an equal partnership in the company. In Sander's time, William Ferguson had owned and run the business, and his son Samuel was captain of the puffer Sander crewed on. By the time Sander came in as a partner, Samuel had taken over from his father, but had proved to be no hand at office matters. Sander, well versed by now in paperwork, undertook to run the office and warehouse on East Harbour, while Samuel returned to his old post as skipper of one of the puffers. From 1918, the business became known as Ferguson, Tollin and Weir. Unfortunately, Samuel Ferguson's financial difficulties proved to be not so much a case of incompetence in the office as a matter of unwise bets on dog racing, followed by Samuel consoling himself over his losses in one of the downtown bars frequented by the watermen. His indulgences, plus the cost of keeping a handsome home for his wife and young son, meant that Samuel had to dip more and more into the office funds. Finally, his debts became so serious that Sander, aware that the company couldn't stand such plundering for much longer, bought the man out, paying what he and others considered to be a fair sum. Soon after Ferguson, Tollin and Weir became the Weir Shipping Company, Samuel Ferguson drowned one dark night in the East Harbour, close to where the boats that had once been his were berthed. At the inquest, it transpired that in an act of sheer stupidity, he had tried to recoup his vast losses by gambling with the money he had received for his share of the business, and had lost it. His widow had been forced to sell their fine house in Gourock and buy something much smaller in Port Glasgow for herself and her schoolboy son. Whether her husband's death was an accident or the final act of a man made desperate by one failure after another, nobody ever knew, but Janet Ferguson had made no secret of her belief that Sander was to blame. He had refused to let the woman trouble him, telling his wife and daughter that he had no reason to feel guilty, as all his dealings with Samuel had been made fairly in the offices of a lawyer and with Samuel's full agreement. But Janet's venomous looks whenever they happened to meet had upset both Georgina and Morag. Even when Sander offered work to young Callum Ferguson, Janet had interpreted the move as a way to rub her nose in the fact that her son was working for another man in the very business he should have inherited. Georgina and Morag had both felt guiltily relieved when Janet died of pneumonia 2 years before Georgina's own death. When Morag, in her final year at school, had shown him how to work out a ledger entry that was causing problems, Sander had almost burst with pride at her ability. After that, she had been encouraged to help whenever he had occasion to work on the Weir Shipping Company books at home, and since his illness, when he was forced to do what work he could from his sickbed, he had come to rely heavily on her for assistance. Morag had always enjoyed the bookwork. The 5 Weir boats had been named after some of the smaller West Coast islands: Plada, Ailsa Craig, Sanda, Jura and Coll, and it was a joy to her to trace their journeying in